Hey Planeswalkers, this is Eric from Bay and Alley Magic, bringing you another deck tech video. Today we're talking about Samut, Voice of Dissent. But first, if you like this video, please hit that like button. It helps out a lot. So Samut is one of my favorite aggro commanders, and I do pronounce it Samut. I don't think Samut sounds right. So anyway, Samut is a 3/4 legendary human warrior that's 3 generic, a red and a green to cast, and she has 4 awesome keyword abilities: Flash, Double Strike, Vigilance, and Haste. She also says that other creatures we control have haste, and her final ability is that you can pay a white and tap her to untap another target creature. And because of that last ability, our colors of this deck are Naya, or white, red, and green. So what I love about Samut is she's a badass. She's the baddest badass babe ever to brutalize the battlefield. I mean, look at her. 2 swords, screaming a war cry. I mean, she's like Michonne from The Walking Dead. Or better yet, she's like Vasquez from Aliens. This deck has 2 strategies. So our first strategy is Samut. Just Samut. Yeah. That's all that needs to be said, right? No? Oh, okay. Well, for those who can't figure it out, the strategy is to send Samut into combat and have her kill some fools. You know, Double Strike, Flash, Haste, Vigilance. All this means that there is literally no reason not to have her attack. It's a waste not to have her attack. She's all about attacking. Think of it as though you had Michael Jordan suddenly appear on your basketball team. Your strategy becomes give Mike the ball, and that's it. Therefore, we have multiple pieces in the deck that we can give to Samut to make her even more terrifying.
Look, man, I only need to know one thing. Where they are. Anytime, anywhere.
The second strategy of this deck focuses on Samut's ability to give all of our other creatures haste. So our secondary goal is basically to get out really ridiculous creatures and give them all haste. So we have plenty of big scary monsters that do crazy things when they attack, and this is such a powerful strategy in Commander. You know, when you think about it, giving your creatures the ability to attack right away means you can almost always get value out of them. Even if your creature has a myriad of other abilities like Double Strike and Indestructible, if it can't attack right away, it will need to wait through your opponent's entire turn. And in Commander, that's 3 opponents' entire turns. 3 turns in which they all get to untap their lands and draw at least 1 card. A card which could be used to enchant your creature, destroy your creature, make you sacrifice your creature, exile your creature, or even gain control of it. Haste not only guarantees that at least 1 attack is available, but it also literally gives you an extra attack phase that you did not have otherwise. If you think about 1 versus 1 formats, what is the most prominent deck built across them all? Aggro Red Burn, which almost always, I mean pretty much always, includes creatures with haste. So before we get into the deck proper, I want to talk about Flash and Haste real quick. When a card has Flash, it means you can cast the card anytime you can cast an instant. It is similar to Haste in that you can cast a creature with Flash, that if you cast a creature with Flash during your opponent's end step, it almost guarantees that your creature will be able to attack. So, you know, kind of guaranteeing your creature can attack is how it's similar to Haste. And just like Haste, your opponent is caught off guard, and so their lands are more likely to be tapped because the opponent was more likely to have used their lands during their own turn, not planning on the fact that you had a Flash creature. Hence, they are less likely to use a removal spell, and more likely to have already used their removal on something else. the element of surprise makes both Flash and Haste great abilities. Now, some would argue that Flash is better because you can respond to literally anything on the stack, and you can even throw out a blocker the opponent didn't expect. It's a good point, and in certain situations it's absolutely true, such as with, Snapcaster Mage. But on the other hand, I disagree. My argument would be that Haste is actually better because it gives you an extra combat step, whereas Flash can only give you more of a guarantee that your creature will attack on your combat step after the turn you got the mana to cast it. Though, Flash is useful in other situations, like with Snapcaster Mage, certain creatures, you want to have Flash on them. It all just depends. So thankfully, Samut has both Flash and Haste. So you can always choose not to have that extra combat step if having Samut enter the battlefield as a response to another effect is more of what you're going for, or is it's going to work better for you in the situation. So let's get into the deck, starting with Elvish Piper. So Samut over here. Elvish Piper is a 1/1 elf shaman for 3 generic and a green, and you may pay a green and tap it, and you can put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this creature I prefer in the deck over Champion of Ronus, because with Elvish Piper, the creature you get out can attack right away. With Champion of Ronus, the creature is only going to come out during your attack step, in which you've already declared all the attackers already. So the creature you get out with Champion of Ronus can't attack right away. So in the Samut deck, Elvish Piper can activate her ability right away because Elvish Piper now has haste, and the creature Elvish Piper gets out can attack right away. So this is huge in this deck, and like I said, we got plenty of scary monsters that we want to cheat out with Elvish Piper. And we also have Thran Temporal Gateway. I'm thinking of also getting Quicksilver Amulet for the deck, of course. Thran Temporal Gateway is a little better, though, because we actually have tons of artifacts and tons of legendary permanents in the deck, so Thran Temporal Gateway is actually really good in this deck. So it's 4 generic for a legendary artifact, and you can pay 4 and tap it, and you may put a historic permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So historics are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So as you'll see, we have plenty of legendary creatures that this is going to work great with. Very similar to Elvish Piper. So, on the start, we're going to start with some big spooky creatures that we want to give haste. That we love giving haste to these creatures because otherwise your opponents will pretty much target them and try to destroy them right away. So, what's better than having a bomb is having a bomb with haste. So Vigor is 3 generic and 3 green for an elemental incarnation, which is a 6/6 trample. And Vigor says, if damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage, and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. When Vigor is put into a graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle it back into its owner's library. So Vigor kind of never dies. It has to get exiled or it keeps going back into your library and gets shuffled in. So great card, especially to give haste, and protects your creatures, protects Samut, makes Samut bigger. That's all. Those are all things we want. Worldspine Worm is 8 generic and 3 green for a 15/15 trample worm. And when Worldspine Worm dies, put 3 5/5 green worm creature tokens with trample onto the battlefield. When Worldspine Worm is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. So, yeah, again, just like Vigor, the Worldspine Worm keeps coming back. And, very similar to Wormcoil Engine, I like that this worm also leaves worms behind. You chop a worm in half and it has 2 brains, right? So this worm apparently has 3 brains dispersed throughout it. So Worldspine Worm is obviously a humongous, ridiculous, very scary creature that we love to give haste. Next we got some angels. Aurelia the War Leader is 2 generic, 2 red, and 2 white for a 3/4 angel, which has flying, vigilance, and haste. And whenever Aurelia the War Leader attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So I put Aurelia and the next card in kind of every single red-white deck. So the next card is Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight, 4 generic, a red and 2 white, so that's 7 mana total for a 5/5 legendary angel with flying and first strike. And Gisela says, if a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. If a source would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent half that damage rounded up. So the confusing thing about this ability is you gotta remember the amount of damage that is prevented is halved and rounded up. It's not the amount of damage that is dealt, which is halved and rounded up. So, whenever a creature deals 1 damage, half of that damage rounded up is prevented. Half of 1 rounded up is 1. So 1 damage is prevented. People get confused with this because they think it's 1 damage that's dealt, but she doesn't say that. It doesn't say instead half that damage is dealt, rounded up. It says half that damage is prevented, rounded up. So she basically negates all instances of 1 damage. So, Niv Mizzet can, kiss it, because all of Niv Mizzet's 1 damage abilities from you drawing cards are just not going to deal you any damage at all. And, when she attacks, she's going to be dealing 10 damage. When someone blocks her, they're only going to be dealing half of their power to her. You got to remind people over and over again because they forget, man. They think that they're still dealing the right amount of damage. There's just so many triggers in Magic. You got to watch other people. You got to watch yourself and make sure, every single source. It says if a source, that means literally anything. If for literally any reason they would be dealt damage. Now remember that loss of life doesn't count as damage. So, if someone's draining you for life loss, that isn't affected by this. But literally all combat damage, all damage dealt in any way is double to your opponents and your opponent's permanents, and it's cut in half for you. It's the amount dealt to you is prevented. Prevent half that damage rounded up. It's important to remember how it's worded here. So having Gisela and Aurelia the War Leader, these 2 cards are absolutely bonkers in any deck with red and white. They're not that expensive either, so if you're playing red and white, get these cards. Oh my gosh, they kill it. But more importantly too, Gisela is just one of those cards that never survives around the table. 90% of the time, your 3 opponents are going to tutor up something to try to kill Gisela. So, giving Gisela haste, getting that value out of her, getting that extra combat step with Gisela is just huge. Etali the Primal Storm is the first in our dinosaur package here. So Etali is a 6/6 Elder Dinosaur for 4 generic and 2 red, so 6 mana total. And whenever Etali attacks, exile the top card of each player's library, including your own. And then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So in a 4-player game, you're getting up to 4 spells you get to cast absolutely for free whenever Etali attacks. So again, giving Etali that extra combat step is absolutely huge. And, let's not forget Aurelia can just give you another combat step as well. Super good. Next dinosaur we got is Goring Ceratops. For 5 generic and 2 white, you get a 3/3 dinosaur that has double strike, and whenever Goring Ceratops attacks, other creatures you control gain double strike until the end of the turn. So all your creatures gain double strike. This is another thing that if you pulled it out without giving it haste, it more than likely is not going to survive long enough to give you the advantage it's supposed to give you for 7 mana. So giving creatures like this haste is super important. Next dinosaur is Ghalta Primal Hunger. 10 generic and 2 green. That's right, 12 mana for our 12/12 trample buddy here. But Ghalta Primal Hunger costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control. So you can possibly cast Ghalta Primal Hunger for just 2 mana. 2 green mana for a 12/12 trample is never a bad deal. And so let's give that haste too. Zakama is our last dinosaur. Zakama Primal Calamity, 6 generic, red, green, and white for a legendary Elder Dinosaur, which is a 9/9 with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. And when Zakama Primal Calamity enters the battlefield, if you cast it, untap all lands you control. So it is an enter the battlefield effect, but you also have to cast it, so it is a cast effect. And so Zakama has 3 activated abilities, 1 for each head. And when you cast Zakama, you get to untap all your lands, and so, you know, if you have 9 lands, you are going to be able to activate each of these abilities, or you can activate any number of them. You know, you can make 3 activations in any combination you want. 1 for each head. So the first head here says, pay 2 generic and a red, Zakama deals 3 damage to target creature. The next head here says, pay 2 generic and a green, destroy target artifact or enchantment. And the last head, you know, licking its own tail over there, says, pay 2 generic and a white, you gain 3 life. So, not much to say. It's also great that Zakama doesn't have to tap to activate any of these abilities. You can just activate them as many times as you have the mana. Zakama is also a great substitution commander for this deck. If you need another commander choice to sub out in this deck, Zakama is a fabulous choice just to start destroying things if you want to go more on the removal side. Next, we got our Eldrazi package. You know, what's better than an Eldrazi with Annihilator? An Eldrazi with Haste and Annihilator, yeah. So, Bane of Bela Ged is 7 mana for a 7/5 Eldrazi, and whenever Bane of Bela Ged attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. So it's kind of worse than Annihilator because they actually have to exile it instead of sacrificing it. Our next Eldrazi is Ulamog's Crusher, 8 generic for an 8/8 Annihilator 2, which means whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents, and Ulamog's Crusher attacks each turn if able. And we want it to attack each turn if able because it has Annihilator 2, which just Annihilator, everybody gets freaked out over Annihilator. They're going to try to kill your Annihilator creature as quickly as possible, so we need to give our Annihilator creatures haste. Kozilek, the Great Distortion, is 8 generic and 2 diamond mana, which means the source for that mana has to be colorless. You can't use colored mana to pay for these 2 diamond symbols here. It has to come from a colorless source, either from a land that's a waste, or a land that lets you produce colorless mana, or an artifact that lets you produce colorless mana. I can't remember colored source. So anyway, Kozilek is a 12/12 Eldrazi that says when you cast Kozilek, the Great Distortion, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, draw cards equal to the difference. So if you have less than 7 cards, you get to have a hand with 7 cards. And Kozilek has Menace, which is not something you should forget. A 12/12 with Menace, that's huge. And finally, you can discard a card with converted mana cost X and counter target spell with converted mana cost X. This is an ability I feel like that people forget the most with Kozilek, or they don't use enough with Kozilek. Kozilek turns every single spell in your hand, every single card in your hand, into a counterspell. You can even use a land and discard a land to counter a spell that's converted mana cost 0. So having an entire hand of counterspells is always useful. It just has to have the same converted mana cost as the spell that you're countering. 1-for-1 is not a bad deal with counterspells. Next on our Eldrazi, we got Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre, 11 mana for a 10/10 Eldrazi with Indestructible. And when you cast Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre, you get to destroy target permanent. That's anything. A land, planeswalker, enchantment, whatever you want. Any permanent, you get to destroy it. And Ulamog has Annihilator 4. Annihilator 4. Yeah, give Ulamog the ball. Whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. If they don't have anything else, they gotta sacrifice their lands. I mean, geez. This is spooky. And when Ulamog is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles it back into their library. So Ulamog never dies. You gotta exile it, or Ulamog can always come back. Spooky. The Infinite Gyre. Let's give it haste. Yay. It that betrays is 12 generic for an Annihilator 2, 11/11 creature. And whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. So yeah, right away we're going to attack with this. We're going to get 2 permanents from the defending player. That is huge. Or, you know, if a player just chooses to sacrifice something with their sacrifice deck, you know, we just get all of that. If they just sacrifice their fetch land to tutor for a land, we get that fetch land. It That Betrays is a really busted card. And last on our huge monsters list, we got Karametra, God of Harvests, 3 generic, a green and a white, for a legendary enchantment creature god. That's a 6/7 indestructible, but as long as your devotion to green and white is less than 7, Karametra isn't a creature. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may search your library for a forest or plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. We do have quite a bit of creatures here, so we want to get them out. As you notice, we have quite a bit of big creatures here, so it doesn't help to, you know, ramp into them as well. So Karametra is a pretty good choice for this deck. Not bad at all. Alright, into some other ramp creatures. We got Wayward Swordtooth, 2 generic and a green for a 5/5 dinosaur. Yeah, 5/5 for only 3 mana. It has Ascend, which means if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. So you get the City's Blessing either when you cast something with Ascend, or if you have something with Ascend on the battlefield, and then you eventually get 10 permanents. Then you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. So Wayward Swordtooth says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Very good for ramp. And Wayward Swordtooth can't attack or block unless you have the City's Blessing, which, you know, with Wayward Swordtooth's own ability, you know, it helps you get the City's Blessing because you're able to play an extra land on each of your turn. So you're able to get Ascend normally quickly already in Commander, but with Wayward Swordtooth, you get it even quicker. That 5/5 for only 3 mana is great to give haste to. Mina and Den Wildborn also let you play an extra land on each of your turns. They're a 4/4 elf ally for 2 generic, a red and a green. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and you may pay a red and a green to return a land you control to its owner's hand. If you do, target creature gains trample until the end of the turn. So you can give your creature trample, return a land to your hand, and if you haven't already played your second land for turn, you can just play that land again. You know, and so great value here with Mina and Den. Giving our creatures trample, like Samut. Giving her trample isn't bad at all. Next we got Bomat Courier is the start of our creatures that draw us cards. So it's a 1/1 for 1 for an artifact creature construct that has haste. And whenever Bomat Courier attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. You can look at it. And if you pay a red and discard your hand, you sacrifice Bomat Courier and put all the cards exiled with Bomat Courier into their owner's hands. So this card, I realized, actually would work great in a graveyard strategy too, because you get to discard your whole hand and replace it with more cards. So this is a great little 1/1 for 1, and it can equal, you know, you don't even have to tap it to activate the ability. So as long as you have 1 red mana open, you always have the choice of discarding your hand to replace your hand with the cards you got with Bomat Courier if you think those cards are going to work out better for you. You know, so great little way to get some card advantage, get some damage in with haste right on turn 1. And if you want to, you can always discard your hand with it and get more cards. Or not, you don't have to. Ripjaw Raptor is 2 generic and 2 green for a 4/5 creature with Enrage. It's a dinosaur creature, by the way. And whenever Ripjaw Raptor is dealt damage, you get to draw a card. So given this creature, haste is great. You attack the people who have a bunch of little chump blockers, and you know you're hopefully going to be able to draw a card with it on the turn that you cast it, because you're giving it haste with Samut. So this is Mother of Runes, which is the first creature in our several creatures that help protect Samut and make sure she survives long enough to kill people. So Mother of Runes is a 1/1 cleric for 1 white. and you can tap Mother of Runes and give target creature you control protection from any color of your choice. Next we got Bastion Protector, 2 generic and a white for a 3/3 human soldier. And Bastion Protector says commander creatures you control get +2/+2 and have indestructible. So she's going to make Samut a 5/6 indestructible double strike vigilance haste flash.
Hey Vasquez, have you ever been mistaken for a man?
No. Have you?
Oh, Vasquez. He just too bad.
Shalai, Voice of Plenty, 3 generic and a white for a 3/4 legendary angel, which has flying. And she says you, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof. And you can pay 4 generic and 2 green and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So Shalai can pump up your whole team, she can pump up Samut, and she gives everyone, your entire board, you, everything except for Shalai gets hexproof. Pretty awesome. Next we have Weatherlight Duelist, which is 1, a green, and a white for a legendary cat warrior with first strike. And whenever a Weatherlight Duelist attacks, each opponent can't block with more than one creature this combat. As long as Weatherlight Duelist is tapped, no more than one creature can attack you each combat. So Miri is really great for making sure that Samut is going to get her damage in, or at least Samut can only be blocked by one creature, and even if Samut is blocked by that one creature, then Miri's not going to be blocked by that creature. And also just making sure that no more than one creature can attack you each combat is really huge in preventing damage. A lot of people wonder what's going on with Miri in the storyline, because if you don't know, there's another card called Miri the Cursed, I think. It's a cat vampire that is this same creature. So they're wondering, you know, why isn't Miri a vampire? Why is Miri back to normal? Well, what I recall, Sarkhan went back in time, and he changed the timeline. So lots of stuff's going to be different. Lots of characters, especially in this set, in this commander set that Miri came out in, lots of characters were different. They were reprints of older characters, and everyone's like, why are they so different? Well, again, it's because Sarkhan went back in time, changed the timeline, and so everything's different. Time travel explains everything in stories. Gosh, don't you know that? Alright, so next we got some creatures that are helpful in removing things. Alright? You got trouble, you gotta get rid of it. So, Knight of Autumn is 1 generic, a green and a white for a Dryad Knight. That's a 2/1, and when Knight of Autumn enters the battlefield, you get to choose one. So you either put 2 +1/+1 counters on Knight of Autumn, you get to destroy target artifact, or destroy target enchantment, or you gain 4 life. So Knight of Autumn is what's considered kind of a strictly better Reclamation Sage, which is another creature that's a 3-drop, that's a 2/1, that lets you destroy target artifact or enchantment. So this has a couple of other options. So if you are running white, this is a great replacement or a great addition to Reclamation Sage. Next we have Glorybringer, 3 generic and 2 red for a 4/4 dragon with flying and haste, and you may exert Glorybringer as it attacks. When you do, it deals 4 damage to target non-dragon creature an opponent controls. So Samut also gives us the ability to untap our exerted creatures if you're running any exert creatures in your deck, such as Glorybringer. With Samut, you can pay 1 white and tap her to untap any creatures. So you can untap your exert creatures. Very cool. Next we have Angel of Serenity, 4 generic and 3 white for a 5/6 flying angel. And when Angel of Serenity enters the battlefield, you may exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield and/or creature cards from graveyards. When Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hands. So, Angel of Serenity has the advantage of both being able to exile your opponent's threats, but also being able to exile things from your own graveyard, so you can eventually get those things back to your hand. Next we have Acidic Slime, 3 generic and 2 green for a 2/2 ooze with Death Touch. And when Acidic Slime enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. This card pretty much goes in every single green deck, so you should get one if you're playing green. Great removal on a creature with Death Touch Having a 2/2 Death Touch blocker is always good. Next we have Combat Celebrant, 2 generic and a red for a 4/1 human warrior. And if Combat Celebrant hasn't been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase there is an additional combat phase. So you get an extra combat phase. It can do it right away because it has haste with Samut, and Samut can untap Combat Celebrant when you exert it because of Samut's own ability. What's great in 1 versus 1, if you have multiple Combat Celebrants, you know, you can exert the first one, then on the next combat phase you exert the next one, and you get an extra combat phase. Pretty cool combo there. Next we have Aven Mind Sensor, which is the start of just some other utility creatures. So Aven Mind Sensor is a 2 generic and a white for a 2/1 flash flying bird wizard. And if an opponent would search a library, that player searches the top 4 cards of that library instead. So it's great to flash this in response to your opponent trying to tutor up something, or even just trying to search for a land with a fetch land, or just trying to look at the top, you know, X cards of their library. They can only look at the top 4 cards of that library. Also, this prevents them from searching your library if someone has some kind of messed up deck where they get to search your library for things and exile them or gain control of them. Aven Mind Sensor makes it so people can only search the top 4 cards of any library. Great in any white deck. Good at a low price right now since they reprinted it in Amonkhet. Next we got Thalia Heretic Cathar, 2 generic and a white for a legendary human soldier, which is a 3/2 first strike. And she says creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, which is huge. You know, we have, our whole team has haste, and we are basically eliminating haste from our opponents. We're also eliminating our opponent's ability to block a lot of the time. So this is actually great synergy in the deck. You know, Thalia and Samut go hand in hand on walks down the Yellow Brick Road, for sure. Next we have Lifecraster's Bestiary, which is the start of our non-creature spells. So we're going to start with some spells that draw us cards. So Lifecraster's Bestiary is 3 generic for an artifact, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, which is not to be underestimated at all. You know, being able to stack the top card of your deck, you know, being able to choose if it's going to be that card or maybe a different card is huge. You know, you want to be able to have the options. You know, if you don't need a land and it's a land, you put that on the bottom and you get the next card. I mean, that is card advantage right there. But, you know, it's technically card selection, which is, you know, what you want. So Lifecraster's Bestiary also says whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green. If you do, you get to draw a card. So we got card selection, and then we get to draw the card by paying a green when we cast a creature spell. Next we have Stolen Strategy, which is 4 generic and a red for an enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until the end of the turn, you may cast non-land cards from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So kind of similar to a Tali Primal Storm, except this doesn't hit our deck, and we have to spend the mana to cast the spells. But still, this is great. You know, we're getting up to 3 extra cards in our hand per turn with this card. And there are opponent's cards, which really makes them happy. Yeah. Next on our draw cards, card advantage section, we got Harmonize, 2 generic and 2 green for a sorcery that says draw 3 cards. Yeah, a really great spell. Kind of goes in any green deck for sure. Just being able to draw 3 cards is pretty helpful. If you don't believe it, put it in a deck and try it out. Next we got Vance's Blasting Cannons, 3 generic and a red for a legendary enchantment. And so we can get this out with the Thran Temporal Gateway. And at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast that card this turn. And then it also says whenever you cast your 3rd spell in a turn, you may transform Vance's Blasting Cannons. So most of the time, we're actually just, you know, using the first ability and just getting kind of an extra card in our hand per turn that we can cast. If we don't cast it, it gets exiled, unfortunately. But oftentimes we are going to be either casting it, and if we don't want to cast it, then it's not that big of a deal that we exile it. But, you know, sometimes it's not going to be, you know, the best to have, you know, have a card that you wanted to maybe spend an instant speed. But I'd say a majority of the time, this is going to be getting you cards in your hand, at least, you know, most of the time. Once in a while, maybe you won't get it, but for the upside, it definitely drowns out the downside of the card, I think. And back to Thran Temporal Gateway real quick. You know, putting a card from your hand onto the battlefield with that, or maybe with a, say, Elvish Piper, means you're not casting it, so it can't be countered with a counter spell. Important thing to remember. Alright, so onto the other side of Vance's Blasting Cannons. We got Spitfire Bastion, which is a legendary land, and it taps to add a mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 generic and a red and tap Spitfire Bastion and have it deal 3 damage to target creature or player. So this transforms from card advantage into mana ramp, you know, which is maybe a little backwards, but, you know, if later in the game you need a little more ramp, you know, you can transform it into this, but it also transforms into direct damage. So if you also need to finish your opponents off, you can transform it into Spitfire Bastion. Alright, next we got Greater Good, which is our sacrifice outlet, you know? And sometimes you gotta sacrifice things for the greater good.
You always were an asshole, Gorman.
So, 2 generic and 2 green for an enchantment that says sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then discard 3 cards. So, I mean, just imagine doing that with, like, Worldspine Worm. Oh my gosh, you know, you get 3 5/5 green trample, creature tokens out of it, this is shuffled back into your library, you draw 15 cards and then discard 3 cards. Now, obviously, that's the ceiling on this card with this deck, you know, that's the most powerful creature. But we have plenty of high-powered creatures that, you know, we will end up getting some card advantage out of this. And also, you know, just having a sacrifice outlet is really important to prevent our opponents from gaining control of our creatures, from exiling our creatures, from enchanting our creatures. You know, it's a great way to respond to our opponents, even making copies of our creatures, you know. So having a sac outlet is great for all of those things, important for every deck. Next we have Corvath's Fury, 4 generic and a red for a sorcery, and it says for each player, choose friend or foe. Each friend discards all the cards from their hand, then draws that many cards +1. Corvath's Fury deals damage to each foe equal to the number of cards in their hand. So, one thing I like to do with this card is when I know my opponent has a hand that they really want to keep, you know, but they want to make a deal with me, but I don't want to make a deal with them, I say to them, you know, we're friends, right? You know, Saffron Olive style, we're friends, right? You know, and they're like, yeah, we're friends. I'm like, all right, great. Friend, you discard all the cards in your hand and then draw that many cards. And so often that's going to really upset them. But also, you know, choosing foe isn't bad for anybody here. Obviously, you're going to choose for yourself to discard all the cards in your hand and draw that many cards +1 because, you know, you're casting this at a time when you want to get rid of those cards and get some new cards. Next we have Staff of Nin, 6 generic for an artifact. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card. So you draw a card in addition to the card you're already drawing per turn, which is great, pure card advantage. And also Staff of Nin, you can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Right, a little bit of a removal there, or at least hitting 1 player every turn for 1 damage isn't bad. Next we have Whisper Silk Cloak, 3 generic for an equipment, and it says equipped creature is unblockable and can't be the target of spells or abilities, and it has equip 2. So making Samut unblockable is absolutely ridiculous. Making any of our dream team unblockable is absolutely ridiculous. You know, our annihilator creatures, our angels. So perfect equipment for this deck, and this is the start of our equipment. Are things that we want to be giving to Samut or our big creatures to make them absolutely ridiculous. So next on our equipment we got Godsend, 1 generic and 2 white for a legendary equipment, so we can get this in with Thran Temporal Gateway if we feel like someone might be trying to counter it. And it's equip 3. Equipped creature gets +3/+3, and whenever equipped creature blocks or becomes blocked by 1 or more creatures, you may exile one of those creatures. And opponents can't cast cards with the same name as cards exiled Godsend. So if you happen to exile their commander with this, they can't cast their commander as long as Godsend is on the battlefield. It doesn't even have to be attached to a creature. So this is going to make Samut a 6/7 double strike that exiles things that block it or that it blocks. Pretty sweet. Next we got Blackblade Reforged, 2 generic for a legendary equipment, and it says equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. And its equipment, its normal equip cost is 7, but you can pay 3 to equip it to a legendary creature. So Blackblade Reforged, it just makes Samut absolutely huge. You know, +1/+1 for each land you control. And you gotta remember too, since she has double strike, that +1/+1 is equaling 2 damage, you know, for each +1/+1 she's getting. So absolutely bonkers. In any, you know, sort of Voltron deck or any deck where you want to get commander damage in, get a Black Blade Reforged. Next we got Celestial Mantle, 3 generic and 3 white for an aura. It says enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +3/+3, so Samut is going to be a 6/7. And whenever enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, double its controller's life total. So it's important to remember that whenever something says, you know, whenever the creature deals combat damage, whenever anything says that, when the creature has double strike, it's going to be dealing combat damage twice. So Samut could potentially quadruple your life total with Celestial Mantle if she gets through unblocked. Next we have Gift of Immortality, 2 generic and a white for an enchantment. Aura says whenever enchanted creature dies, return the card to the battlefield under its owner's control, then return Gift of Immortality to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. So as long as your opponent doesn't kill your creature twice in a row, your creature is going to keep coming back from the dead. This is especially great when attached to a Solemn Simulacrum. You know, that just gets out of hand really quickly. I don't have Solemn in this deck because, you know, I'm playing green, so I don't need the ramp as much. Next we got our ramp package. Speaking of ramp, starting with Mind Stone, 2 generic for an artifact that taps for 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 1 and tap this and sacrifice it to draw a card. So both ramp and card draw on an artifact. Pretty important in Commander where we run out of room in our deck very quickly, even though we have 100 cards. Solar Ringer! Get 1. Next we have Worn Power Stone, 3 generic for an artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, but when you tap it, it adds 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. A Soul Ring for 3 mana. Next we have Sword of the Animist, 2 generic for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library, and it's equipped 2. So Sword of the Animist is essential for any deck not running green. It is a great ramp artifact. I suggest you get one if you're not running green. It's going to get you lands on the battlefield as long as you have creatures out. Next we have Pier's Whim, 3 generic and a green for a sorcery. It's another friend or foe card, so for each player, choose friend or foe. Each friend searches their library for a land, puts it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffles their library. Each foe shuffles an artifact or enchantment they control. Each foe sacrifices an artifact or enchantment they control. So it's important to point out here the politics of the game, I guess. You know, I can't tell you how many times I make deals with people. Yeah, like, yeah, I could kill your commander right now. You know, I could kill you right now, but do you want to work for me? You know, let's say I keep you in the game and you do whatever I say, you know? I mean, that deal should always be out there, especially if you feel like someone's going to be salty, you know, feel like someone's going to get mad if you do something. You know, in that situation, I always say, well, hey, well, let's make a deal. I'll not attack you if you just say you don't attack me. You know, it works out pretty well. And you choose friend for that person. Next we got Dreamstone Hedron, 6 generic for an artifact. You tap it for 3 colorless mana, or you can pay 3 generic mana and tap it and sacrifice Dreamstone Hedron, and you get to draw 3 cards. So just like Mind Stone, you know, a little ramp, a little card draw, both on 1 card. Pretty great. Next we got our removal package, starting with Swords to Plowshares. Just 1 white for an instant speed spell. You exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. So, pretty great card. Your opponent is going to be gaining some life, you know, especially the bigger the threat is. But, I mean, being able to exile it at instant speed for just 1 mana is fantastic. Not as great as Path to Exile, though, which is also 1 mana, 1 white for an instant speed spell. It says exile target creature. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. So with Path to Exile, instead of gaining life, they just get a basic land out of the deal. I actually used this yesterday in response to my opponent trying to attach a Whisper Silk Cloak to their Vivictus Asmati, and I was like, yeah, I can't let that happen. Vivictus Asmati the Dire with a Whisper Silk Cloak, I have to exile it with Path to Exile in response So, again, having that instant speed removal is what's really important in the game. You can destroy things on your turn, but often you want to wait. You want your opponent to spend the mana to try to equip things, and then respond to that with Path to Exile. That way you're getting a 2-for-1. You're having them spend mana. You're having them spend maybe an extra card in their hand, like an enchantment or something, and then you exile their thing. So all of that mana and that enchantment is wasted, and their creature gets exiled. Next we have Fumigate, 3 generic and 2 white for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures and you gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. Sometimes you just don't have the table advantage and you need to destroy everything and reset the board. Often the person who plays the board wipe at the right time is going to be the one who wins the game strategically. So next we have Day of Judgment, 2 generic and 2 white for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures. And next we have a very similar spell, Wrath of God, 2 generic and 2 white for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures, and they can't be regenerated. And lastly on our removal we have Comet Storm, which is X and red for a instant speed spell with multi-kicker 1. So you can pay an additional 1 mana any number of times as you cast this spell. And Comet Storm says choose target creature or player, then choose another target creature or player for each time Comet Storm was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. So let's say you're just trying to kill your 3 opponents with Comet Storm. They're each down to 1 life, let's say, for example. So first you got to pay the 2 red mana, and then you're automatically going to target 1 opponent. So you just have to multi-kick it twice. So you pay 2 red and 2 generic to target all 3 opponents, and then you pay X, which if you have 3 opponents, that's another 3. So in that situation, if each opponent has 1 life, you will have to pay 7 mana into Comet Storm to kill each opponent. This is great when you team it up with Neheb the Eternal, which just, gives you tons of red mana for dealing your opponent's damage. So if you got a Neheb the Eternal deck, you gotta have a Comet Storm. But this is very commonly used to end games more often than just remove a creature or something like that. Next we got Heroic Intervention, which is the start of just some utility spells. Heroic Intervention is an instant for 1 generic and a green, and it says permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. Yeah, they can't be targeted, and they can't be destroyed. The only way to kill your creatures after you cast Heroic Intervention is with a Merciless Eviction, I guess. Next we have Brave the Sands, 1 generic and a white for an enchantment that says creatures you control have vigilance, and each creature you control can block an additional creature. So we got this kind of keyword soup building up with Samut, Voice of Dissent. So we already are giving our creatures haste so they can attack right away. Giving them the ability to block right away is also huge, to block as well as attack with vigilance. And the ability to block an additional creature. So this is going to be preventing a lot of the damage that we are going to be receiving because people are going to be hating on us pretty hard. We're aggro, that's the way it goes. Next we got Primal Command, 3 generic and 2 green for a sorcery, and it says choose 2. So choose any 2 of these 4 modes. So the first mode is target player gains 7 life. The next mode is put target non-creature permanent on top of its owner's library. The next mode is target player shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. And the last mode is search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So most often we're going to be using the last mode to tutor for any creature we want and put it into our hand and shuffle our library. We can also, if someone's trying to mill us out, we can shuffle our graveyard back into our library, or if we're low on life, we can gain 7 life, or if something's giving us trouble, any non-creature permanent can be put on top of its owner's library, even a land. And you get to choose 2 of those. Pretty powerful card. Next we have Gideon's Resolve, 4 generic and a white for an enchantment that says when Gideon's Resolve enters the battlefield, you may search your library and or graveyard for a card named Gideon Martial Paragon, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. And creatures you control get +1/+1. So this is an anthem, and it also allows you to search for Gideon Martial Paragon the Planeswalker. And even if you've already cast it in the game, even if it's already messed up the whole game, you get to get it back from the graveyard with Gideon's Resolve. So Gideon Martial Paragon is 4 generic and a white for a Planeswalker that enters with 5 loyalty counters. You can add 2 loyalty counters to untap all creatures you control, and those creatures get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. For 0, until the end of the turn, Gideon becomes a 5/5 human soldier with indestructible. That's still a planeswalker, and you prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. Normally, when you cast Gideon, you can activate the 0 ability, but he won't be able to attack because he's summoning sick. But with Samut, we get around that. And finally, for -10, creatures you control get +2/+2 until the end of the turn, and you get to tap all the creatures your opponents control. So if you -10 with getting in resolve out, your creatures are going to have a total of +3/+3, and your opponents are going to have no blockers because all their creatures are going to be tapped, whether they're hexproof or indestructible or not. They're going to be tapped, and you get to attack them freely. So that's why we got Gideon Martial Paragon, a cheap card because it came out in the Planeswalker pack, but it actually works pretty good with the Samut strategy. Our last Planeswalker is Garruk, Caller of Beasts, 4 generic and 2 green. Yeah, that's right, I pronounce it Garruk, not Garuk, because my name's Eric, and I think Garruk sounds like a proper name, just like the guy from Star Trek, right? Garruk. So enters with 4 loyalty counters, and you can +1 to reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put all creature cards revealed this way into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. For -3, you may put a green creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, and for -7 you get an emblem with whenever you cast a creature spell, you may search your library for a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So if you get to -7, you get to double every creature you cast. I mean, that is just absolutely ridiculous. You cast a 1/1, you get an Ulamog, sure, and then, the +1, just getting creatures into your hand is huge. And again, the -3 is similar to that, Elvish Piper, Thran Temporal Gateway ability, where we just get to put something from our hand on the battlefield. That's great. Next, we have Teferi's Protection, 2 generic and a white for an instant. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you have protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out, which means while they're phased out, they're treated as though they don't exist. They're not exiled, so even tokens get to get phased out, and they phase in before you untap during your untap step. So this even protects your tokens, but you have to exile Teferi's Protection. So it's only going to protect you for 1 turn, and hopefully after that turn you can recover, and your opponent's still not going to be able to kill you. And that brings us to the lands. So we have 37 lands in the deck, and we have 6 plains, 6 mountains, and 7 forests. And then we have 10 lands that enter the battlefield tapped, and we have a few other lands. So for our 10 lands that enter the battlefield tapped, they all do important things. So Jungle Shrine enters tapped, but it adds a green, a white, or a red to our mana pool. Temple of Plenty enters tapped, and it scries 1. So, scrying 1 is pretty important all the time. So if you're looking for a budget dual land, I suggest getting the Temple lands. They work out pretty good. And Temple of Plenty adds a green or a white to our mana pool. So this next land is Sheltered Thicket, which is the first of our cycling lands. And cycling means if the card is in your hand, you can pay the indicated mana cost, discard the card, and then draw a card. Sometimes things say things like plains cycling, like you can discard the card to search the library for a plains, or sliver cycling, you can discard it to search for a sliver. Normally cycling means you just discard the card and draw a card. And these are really helpful on lands because sometimes you're mana flooded, you already have too many lands, and so you get rid of that land and draw another card instead. So with Sheltered Thicket, it taps to add a green or a red to your mana pool, and it's cycling for 2 mana. This is also a mountain forest, which is really important because we also have Clifftop Retreat and other lands in here that care about us having mountains and plains and forests and things like that. So next we have Hashep Oasis, which is a desert. It's taps to add 1 colorless to your mana pool. You can pay 1 life and tap it to add a green to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 generic, 2 green, and tap it and sacrifice a desert. This is our only desert, so we'll be sacrificing Hashep Oasis. And if you do, target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of the turn. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So the only reason this card's in the deck is because we want to make Samut be a 6/7 till the end of the turn. Yeah, why not? Give Samut the ball. Next we have Boros Garrison, which enters tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand. And when you tap Boros Garrison, you add both a red and a white to your mana pool. So these are what are called the bounce lands, and I think they work really good in any commander strategy. The thing you have to remember is the bounce land. If it's in your opening hand, you don't really want to, keep that opening hand unless you have plenty of other lands and some way to cast spells. But otherwise, if you just play this as your land on turn 2, return your first land to your hand, and you haven't cast any spells, then you're going to have 8 cards in your hand, and you're going to have to discard. So remember that, and also remember that the land that you return to your hand, you want it to be a land that you've already used for mana, and a land that'll re-enter the battlefield untapped. So our next bounce land is Gruul Turf. Same thing, enters tapped. When it enters, return a land you control to its owner's hand, and it taps to add a red or a green to a red and a green to your mana pool. And that kind of mixed in with the cycling lands. So Scattered Groves is another cycling land. Taps to add a green or a white. It's a forest plains, and it has cycling for 2. Next we have Forgotten Cave, which enters tapped. It taps to add a red mana to your mana pool, or you can cycle it away for 1 red mana. And Secluded Steppe is the same thing, except it adds white to your mana pool, and you can cycle it away for 1 white mana. And lastly, we got Slippery Karst, which comes into play tapped. It taps to add a green to your mana pool, or you can cycle it away for 2 mana. Next we have Windbrisk Heights, which is a hideaway land, which means this land enters the battlefield tapped. When it does, look at the top 4 cards of your library. Exile one of them face down, then put the rest on the bottom of your library. So Windbrisk Heights can tap to add a white to your mana pool, or you can pay a white and tap it, and you can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if you attacked with 3 or more creatures this turn. With Samut giving all of our creatures haste, that's not that hard to do. The hideaway lands are pretty great, all except for the one that adds black mana. That one requires all of your opponents to have, or every single player to have no cards in their hand, so that one's pretty hard to pull off. But the other hideaway lands are pretty useful for casting cards for free, which, as you've noticed, with our Dream Team, Zakama, Bane of Galadet, Bane of Balaged, It That Betrays, Ulamog, having any of those underneath Windbrisk Heights isn't a bad deal. Next we have Nephalia Academy, which is a land that taps to add colorless to your mana pool, and it says, if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard a card, you may reveal that card and put it on top of your library instead of putting it anywhere else. So pretty helpful when someone's trying to make you discard cards that you want to keep in your hand. You can put them on top of your library instead. Next we have Opal Palace. This is a land that taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana into your mana pool of any color in your commander's color identity. If you spent this mana to cast your commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone. So this is a highly underutilized land in Commander. I think lots more people should be using it because it's going to pump their commanders up, especially Samut. We're giving her double strike, so for every +1/+1 counter she's going to be dealing an additional 2 damage to whatever she's dealing damage to. And, if you cast her 3 times, she's entering with 3 +1/+1 counters, then that makes her a 6/7. Out of town. Next we have Homeward Path. Not very expensive card, but one that could go in any commander deck. So if you're planning on building a lot of commander decks, it wouldn't be a bad idea to invest in some of these. So it's a land that taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can tap it and each player gains control of all creatures he or she owns. So if in your meta people are trying to gain control of your stuff a lot, you get to regain control of all of your creatures, and everyone gets to regain control of all of their creatures. Of course, you probably wouldn't put this in a deck that gains control of everyone else's creatures. Next we have Temple of the False God, and this taps to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if you control 5 or more lands. This is a great card for Commander. I put it in literally every single Commander deck. I suggest you get one. It's not very hard to get 5 lands, because Temple of the False God also counts in your count towards the land. So as long as you got this and 4 other lands, it works, and it adds 2 mana to your mana pool. Pretty great, and not a very expensive card either. I have never regretted drawing it. I have never played a game where I wasn't able to activate it eventually. So Rogue's Passage is next. It's a land that taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 4 mana and tap it, and target creature can't be blocked this turn. Wow, yeah, that's pretty useful with Samut. Next we have Rootbound Crag. which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest. So again, we got those cycling lands that are both mountains and forests and plains, so those help out a lot, such as, you know, Sheltered Thicket. Next we got Clifftop Retreat, like I mentioned before, enters tapped unless you control a mountain or a plains. And then next we got our basic lands. So with that, that's the end of the deck. That is Samut, Voice of Dissent. And I hope you've enjoyed the Voice of Dissent and the music. I hope you enjoyed the deck. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. This is Eric signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.